We begin tonight in Afghanistan, where warnings of a terrorist attack on Kabul airport have become reality. This afternoon, 2 large explosions rocked the area outside the main gates as thousands of people rushed to try to get onto flights out of the country before Western troops pull out on August the 31st. It's understood 2 suicide bombers blew themselves up at 2 locations in an area on the perimeter of the airport, where those desperate to leave the country have been arriving to try to get access to the main airfield. The full picture is still unclear, but it's believed at least 13 people have been killed, including children. At least 60 people have been injured. Several US personnel are reported to be among those hurt. No group has yet claimed responsibility for the attack, but it's thought to be the work of ISIS-K, the Islamic State group in Afghanistan. Hearing now that the Wall Street Journal, the American newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, is reporting that at least 4 US Marines died in that attack. That is a report coming to us from the Wall Street Journal. We will speak to our correspondents now and try and get a better sense of what's going on. Arise correspondent Philip CROWTHER is monitoring the situation from neighboring Pakistan, and Arise US correspondent Eric Ham is keeping across events in Washington, and they both join me now. Let me go straight away first to you, Eric. That report from the Wall Street Journal suggesting that 4 American Marines, US Marines, died in that attack on Kabul airport. Can you confirm that?
Well, Charles, we are learning, just like you, that there have been a number of casualties at the airport, and we do know that there were some U.S. personnel that were also injured, Marines. As far as the actual casualty of Marines, we are not able to independently verify that at the time. We're still reaching out to our sources from the Pentagon, but what we have heard from the Pentagon at this time is that there were U.S. personnel that were injured, and right now we have no confirmation that those personnel were Marines and in fact are dead at this time.
Well, thanks for that update, Eric. Let's go to Pakistan and speak to Arise correspondent Philip CROWTHER. At least 2 explosions, Philip, plus gunfire, suicide attacks. What do we know so far? There have been descriptions of scenes of carnage.
Yeah, I've watched them so that you don't have to. It's pretty awful, the footage that you're seeing coming in from one of the gates to the Kabul International Airport. That is where thousands of people had been waiting and trying to get into the airport to somehow get onto one or several of those evacuation flights outside the airport. Until now, at least, there were still those who had the documentation to get on the board of those planes flown by coalition aircraft, but also those who were just desperately trying to get out of Afghanistan and into that airport at any cost. Remember that this is a terrorist attack, as it seems, obviously, that had been very much predicted by those who are guarding the airport right now. There had been very, very stark warnings from the United States for days now that a terrorist attack appeared to be imminent. The United States had called for its citizens and those who were going to get on board flights from the United States from Kabul International Airport to not go to those gates anymore. Those warnings were then mirrored by the United Kingdom and by Australia as well. Very, very clear warnings for people not to go to those exact places where those explosions have just happened. Of course, that didn't keep people who are desperate to get out of Afghanistan from being at those gates. Whole families were lining up to somehow get out of the Afghan capital city, and at least from the footage that I've seen, it appears that whole families certainly got hurt in those bombings. We have no way right now of giving you exact casualty figures. It appears very clear that that number of dead is going to be in the double figures, and the number of wounded might be going all the way to triple figures. A very, very serious attack. This one. There's been no organization yet that has taken responsibility for this. The United States, the Biden administration, had talked at length over the last few days about a potential attack from ISIS-K, Khorasan, the Khorasan group within the Islamic State organization that is largely based in Afghanistan. That seemed to be almost the inevitable perpetrators of this attack. But again, we haven't heard from any group yet. We have, though, by the way, heard from the Taliban, who have condemned this attack, but in their statement also very clearly say that this happened in an area that was controlled by the United States. What are they implying by this? Maybe that it wouldn't have happened without US presence. We don't know. But there might be a lot of people out there believing this could have been a Taliban attack. Very, very unlikely. This is more likely to have been an attack against the Taliban and against Western military forces who were at those gates to the international airport in Kabul. Remember that the Islamic State group and the Taliban are essentially enemies.
And Eric, as you mentioned at the outset, and also as Philip touched on there, that this comes after there'd been US warnings that there could be such an attack on Kabul airport. I mean, what's the reaction that you're getting to this in America?
Yeah, you're right. In fact, the U.S. Embassy alerted people last night, Charles, that an attack would be imminent, and that people needed to not actually go to the airport because of the thought that an attack would occur. And we see that this happened. And I also want to pick up on what Philip just said about the Taliban and the ISIS both being enemies of one another, and the Taliban saying that this was an area that was controlled by the United States. And it's important and very telling that they said that, because again, what we have learned is the Taliban has made it clear that the United States staying in Afghanistan beyond August 31st is a red line. And it's clear that the Taliban is now firmly in control of of Afghanistan, and they have made clear that they have held up to their end that there would be no U.S. casualties and that no Americans would be hurt in Afghanistan through this time of August 31st. Well, now we're learning, of course, of these casualties. And while we're still unable to confirm that 4 Americans have in fact been killed, we know U.S. personnel, in fact, have been harmed. And so this certainly will fall under the purview of the Taliban, because they are in control of the country. They have made clear they want to see the United States out. And while they may say this is an attack on the United States, it's clear that ISIS is certainly an enemy of the Taliban, and they certainly would like to inflict as much damage as possible both on the United States and the Taliban. And so clearly this is an issue that is going to only increase the concern, the security issue of being able to get all of the people out between now and August 31st. We're still told that there are about 1,500 Americans still in Afghanistan. At least 500 we know the United States is in contact with. Maybe some of them have left yet. We have not confirmed that. In addition to that, we also know that as of today, more than 97,000 people have been evacuated from Afghanistan, and we're told that the United States is going to continue to evacuate until August 31st.
And Philip, in Pakistan, on the point that Eric made there and that you raised earlier about the Taliban now being in control, I mean, what does this say about their ability to keep security in Kabul and beyond it in Afghanistan?
Well, you'd have to imagine that things are going to change, maybe radically, on the 31st of August, because the enemy from the last 20 years or so will have completely gone. Essentially the makeup of Afghanistan will change completely. It has already, of course, with the political takeover, the takeover of the whole country, 99% of it at least, by the Taliban, just of such a short while ago. Things are changing so rapidly. With the absence of US forces, that enemy will no longer be there. And we've heard from the Taliban, of course, over the last week, trying to show that they can govern this country, that things will be different this time around, that there will be more freedoms for women, for children, for girls to go to school, for example. That example, of course, that important example always given. It is only after the US forces will be gone, I think, that we will get a clearer picture as to what Afghanistan will really look and feel like under Taliban rule. The one thing I'd also mention about the airport and about this attack, of which we're only hearing the details right now, 4 hours after it happened, still trying to ascertain how many casualties there truly were, who might have been responsible. I would mention that this comes at a particularly fraught time at the airport, despite the fact that people were told by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by Australia and others to stay away from those gates. There is a reason why there were so many people there, because we know that the number of flights will be going down drastically. We believe as early as tomorrow, because several European armies have already stopped their evacuation flights completely. The last flights out of Kabul for many European countries, for Belgium, for Denmark as well, for Canada as well, by the way, that was tonight, just a few hours ago. They will not be going back this Friday. From the 27th until the 31st of August, we expect that airfield, the international airport in Kabul, to be almost exclusively manned by US forces. They will be controlling everything, and it will be almost only US flights, US evacuation flights that will be going in and out. And that explains why there were still thousands of people at those gates to the airport, desperately trying to get inside and then onto planes, because it is going to be more and more difficult for them to succeed over the next few days.
Well, absolutely, Philip. And those warnings that you mentioned by intelligence agencies that an attack like this was imminent, I mean, people who were desperate to leave, I mean, that will outweigh those warnings, that desperation, and it clearly did. But let me come to you, Eric. I know it's early days yet, but I wonder what the political fallout of this might be for President Biden, because already some US analysts are suggesting that it looks like America was determined to give away advantage to its enemies.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually in the last few days, we saw the tide beginning to turn with so many evacuations taking place out of Afghanistan, and the United States seeming to gain control of the situation in Afghanistan. And quite frankly, Charles, if we can just go back and just talk a little bit about how the intelligence was able to gather this information about an imminent attack, we're learning it's because the Taliban actually captured an ISIS official, and they were able to get that official to alert them that an attack was in fact imminent, and that's how the United States actually learned about it. But what we are learning, as Philip just mentioned, while so many other countries are leaving the Afghanistan and many have already left, the United States still remains and is attempting to try to get as many people out of the country between now and August 31st. Now, of course, the question will be, when the United States leaves, will there be Americans that will be left behind? Of course, that will be certainly perhaps a major blow politically to President Biden if there are still Americans in Afghanistan that have no way to get out. And so it's clear that right now, we heard from Secretary Blinken that there is an all-out effort to try to get all of Americans out of the country. In fact, we know right now that there are at least 20 Americans from California, a group of families and children who went to Afghanistan to visit extended family and who are still stranded and are unable to get out of the country. So this is still going to be a very difficult puzzle for the Biden administration to try to figure out how to get as many people out as possible, because as we know, many European nations have already completed their evacuations, and it is only the United States, and then we know that Turkey, which has managed the airport for the last 6 years, we now know that they too are leaving, even though they were committed to staying and securing the airport after the U.S. withdrawal. We're now told that they too will be leaving early as well.
And Philip, you are, of course, in Pakistan. What are you hearing about people outside Kabul, beyond the huge focus, for obvious reasons, on the airport? I mean, are people all over the country attempting to flee from Afghanistan? Are they resigned to coexist with the Taliban? We hear people are massing at the border with Pakistan.
Yeah, that's a really big question right now. The only footage that has emerged from one of those border points, one of those main access areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan, does show a throng of people appearing to try to get out of Afghanistan into Pakistan. Now, I've heard from sources at that border who say that maybe those movements aren't anything completely out of the ordinary. We'll only be able to confirm that with our own eyes. You would expect at this point, with the possibility of leaving Afghanistan through the airport, through evacuation flights, that there might be a movement toward the borders, to the borders of Iran, for example, of Kyrgyzstan as well, and of course here with Pakistan. But the basic truth here is that the border with Pakistan is closed. It's been closed by the Pakistani government, and that has been the case for months already. There is your daily traffic of trade and those who might be visiting family members back and forth. That is still happening. But Pakistan essentially is not accepting refugees right now. The Pakistani embassy in Kabul is issuing visas, quite a few a day, quite a few hundred from what we're hearing, and that means that those people, if they're able to get to the border or if they're able to get to a flight, that's no longer really the case to Islamabad. That air bridge essentially closed a few hours ago. So in other words, if they can get on the road and by land to one of those border posts, then in theory they would be allowed in. But the reality, of course, on the ground in Afghanistan is that essentially 99% of the country is controlled by the Taliban. So anybody wanting to move from the inside of the country to the border areas with Pakistan, for example, would have to pass through several Taliban checkpoints. Now, plenty of people have managed to do that. I know of a group of 4 people who managed to get through a series of Taliban checkpoints to the border with Tajikistan and managed to make it out of the country. But that is really, really difficult to do. So we'll have to see how this situation evolves over the next few days.
Philip CROWTHER in Islamabad, and of course Arise US correspondent Eric Ham talking to me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed to both of you.